Hello, everyone. This is part 2 of the Christmas coin, where a homeless man, Joe Evans, stole a mysterious magical coin which acted as a key. And now he must decide whether or not his darkness or his light would rule his life, and whether or not his darkness or his light would allow his daughter to live or die. Joe Evans was mesmerized, absolutely mesmerized by the remarkable and unbelievable beauty that surrounded him. This world beyond his own boasted the most amazing flowers, birds, animals, and the city of Idwich itself, which lay directly in front of him, had the most unimaginably complex and magical architecture he ever could imagine. Yet all of it seemed familiar to him, a little too familiar, and he couldn't quite figure out why. It was almost as if images and things from his childhood was somehow manifested around him, but he couldn't be certain. Was all this a dream? It certainly seemed solid enough. And his daughter. That was the beauty of being a child, I guess. She took all of this in stride. In fact, she seemed so thrilled to be a part of all of this. He looked at her and the smile on her face. He could only imagine that she felt she was a princess in her own private fairy tale. All the little creatures that came, they weren't squirrels, they weren't rabbits, but he couldn't quite figure out what they were. But they were pleasant and harmless, and they all came and greeted them as they walked by. And Angelique herself, tall as she was, unbelievably tall, about 7 feet, was distinctly not human. But she had an ethereal quality about her. One moment she seemed translucent, and then the next moment she seemed completely solid and rooted to the spot. But she led them, peacefully, and with a charm about her, towards the city itself. They didn't make much conversation. I think Angelique was just letting Joe process the images and sensations around him. After all, he had a quest that he had to undergo very shortly. A quest that was supposed to allow him to experience his true self, according to her, and whether or not his darkness or his light was going to win out in the end. But the choice was entirely up to him. What that meant exactly, he did not know, but it filled him with apprehension. He feared mostly for his daughter. What did she have to play in all of this? And the snowman back there that led him to this world told him that because he stole that coin from that bar, he himself, Joe Evans, is responsible for his daughter being there. So he wasn't sure what to expect in the coming hours, but he knew it was going to be challenging. And then off in the distance, those storm clouds, those dark, ominous, evil-looking storm clouds seemed to creep closer and closer towards them. The sight of the clouds themselves and the sound of the rumbling thunder sent a chill through Joe. He didn't understand why. Maybe it was what Angelique said when they first arrived, that storm, that creepy, evil, malevolent storm, was somehow him. It was part of his true self. And he guessed that whatever lay within that storm, he was going to have to face sooner or later. And he didn't like the idea, not one bit. As they arrived at the city gates, the gates were massively large and beautiful to behold. They had a mother-of-pearl quality about them, and they seemed to be etched and bent and twisted in the most beautiful ways. The patterns were beyond description, but beautiful to behold. And the gates parted to allow the three of them in. And as they entered the city, Joe again encountered unbelievably large people, 6.5 to 8 feet tall people that were very much not human. Some had the faces of frogs, some had the faces of peacocks, others of bunny rabbits, raccoons, squirrels, birds. He didn't understand what all of this meant or represented, but the people that he passed looked down on him, pleasantly greeted him, and went about their business. Apparently, he was not more than a simple curiosity to them, a momentary observation, and then they just went about whatever business they had. But Joe did notice one thing, that as they entered the city was blanketed in snow, and he felt a distinct drop in temperature from the springtime outside to the bleak winter inside. D'Angelique took them further and further in, and then she turned to Joe with her inhuman eyes, but a pleasant smile, and told him, "Well, Joe, this is it." And he was very confused and asked, "What is it? What is all of this?" And she says, "This is for you, Joe. All of this is for you. You stole that coin, Joe. Something you shouldn't have done. But now that you have a choice to make. A choice that will affect you and your daughter for the rest of your lives." The sound of rumbling thunder blanketed the city in a depressing sound. Wolves began to howl, and their wailful cry sent chills screaming through Joe's soul. He didn't know why. He's heard wolves before, but this sound was unlike anything that he had ever encountered. It didn't seem right. Somehow all this darkness and the lamentful sounds and cries of the wolves somehow seemed to be like a death cry for the city, and for himself and his daughter if he wasn't careful. He couldn't shake the sensation that extreme darkness and evil was coming, and that he would have to stop it somehow. But why or how, he didn't know. But he trusted D'Angelique to show him the way. D'Angelique looked at Joe and at Veronica, his daughter, and said, "The city is yours now. Do what you feel you must. But remember, the choice is yours. The choice has always been yours." Veronica looked at D'Angelique and said, "Ma'am?" D'Angelique smiled at the ma'am. And she says, "What's going on? I'm frightened." And D'Angelique knelt in the snow and leaned to look into Veronica's eyes and told her, "My dear child, you have an innocence about you, a special quality, and I'm sorry for what you're going to have to undergo, but the choice is not yours or mine to make." And she looked at Joe and said, "You understand, Joe? The choice belongs to you and to you alone. Remember that. We all have choices, and we must accept the consequences of those choices, wherever they lead. And sometimes they'll take you down darkness, and others, they'll take you to the most amazing light." With that, D'Angelique suddenly disappeared. And Joe was frightened. It's like she just vanished right in front of him. But D'Angelique's voice continued on the wind and says, "Go, Joe, go now, and find your way." Joe, making sure that Veronica was bundled up, tried to act as though he had everything completely under control for her sake. After all, he didn't want to worry her unnecessarily, even if he didn't feel very confident within himself. But he took her by the hand and said, "Well, we may as well go look around and see what it is that we are supposed to try to figure out." So he took her by the hand and they started wandering through the city streets, marveling at the most amazing things they've ever seen or could possibly imagine. There were businesses lining the streets up and down with these signs with symbols and writing that neither of them could understand or decipher. And people of ice, crystal, and snow would come and go into these businesses and go about whatever errands that they were undergoing. And then the wolves sounded once again. The wolves that reminded Joe that there's more to all of this than meets the eye. And he better be ever vigilant and keep a sharp lookout for anything that might be considered meaningful, that might point him in a direction. So far, he didn't know any of that, but he had to keep looking and watching and waiting. As they continued down one snowy street, Joe saw something, a structure, way down in what he believed was probably the south side of the city, although he couldn't tell if the sun was any indication, if it was the same in our world and theirs. But this building reminded him of a church. Not just any church, but it looked like an oversized version of a small church his mother had when he was a child. She had this little alpine village that he used to love staring at growing up as part of a Christmas decoration in their home. And this church, when lit up, would fascinate him with the stained glass windows. And here it was, extremely larger than life, more enormous than anything, with the same stained glass windows, the same spires, the same everything. He felt, well, there's something familiar. And so far he's had pretty good experiences with churches. And he knew that if he was to continue on this journey, he had to keep his daughters safe. And what better place than a church? So he wandered up the frozen steps, nearly slipping several times, but he grabbed a hold of his daughter and made sure she stayed safe as they climbed the steps to the very large wooden doors with the carved etchings and imagery that he didn't understand etched into the wooden surface. He grabbed a hold of the large knocker and pulled it. The door slowly crept open, and he and his daughter were able to open it enough where they could slip through. And it was warmer inside, and that was comforting to him. And Veronica seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The warmth enveloping her and penetrating her soul, where she seemed a little more at ease. And Joe looked around at the very inhuman occupants of the structure and decided to investigate further. So he took his daughter and wandered further into the building. The architecture seemed very church-like. There were traditional pews, and that made him feel better. At least there was something that seemed fairly normal in this world of backwards and upside-down things. And then he looked around and spotted someone that looked like it could be a clergyman, but it had the head of a white rabbit. The white rabbit noticed him looking in his direction and approached them and greeted them. "Welcome!" And he says, "I don't recognize you. Are you new here?" And Joe says, "Yes, we're very new here. In fact, we just arrived, and we're not sure where we are, what we're doing here, or where we're supposed to go. But I thought this would be a good place to stop." And the rabbit laughed in his little bucktooth way and said, "Well, you can never go wrong with a church. Welcome." He said, "And who are you?" And he says, "I am Joseph Evans, and this is my daughter, Veronica." And the rabbit was so pleased to meet them. And the rabbit identified himself, but Joe couldn't identify the language, much less repeat it. But he just was happy to say, "Well, thank you," and avoid the subject of the rabbit's name. And he asked the rabbit if there was something that he could do for him. He had to go out and investigate the city further, but he needed to make sure that his daughter was safe. And the rabbit says, "Oh, naturally, certainly, we'd be more than happy to take care of her." And the rabbit looked at him and says, "Investigate. Investigate what?" And the rabbit's face became grim and says, "You're not Joseph Evans by any chance. The Joseph Evans, are you?" And Joe was concerned. He says, "Why, what Joseph Evans would I be?" And the rabbit says, "You're the one that Angelique was telling us about. The one that is going to dispel the darkness." And Joe was very confused. He said, "Well, I've been told sort of the same thing, but I really don't know what that means or what I'm supposed to do." And the rabbit looked at him, leaned forward, and said, "You must go, Joe. You must go and find yourself. That is the only way to set things right. It is the only way to keep us safe. And most importantly, it is the only way that you and your daughter will have a future." Joe didn't like the sound of that, but he felt he had no choice, and he got a chill all of a sudden and bundled himself further against the chill and cold. And he asked the rabbit, "Well, what if I fail?" And the rabbit looked at him and says, "Then there is no hope for anyone here. And your daughter will be doomed to darkness forever." The rabbit told Joe that he had to go now, while there was still time. "Don't worry about Veronica. She'll be safe and waiting for you, if you return." Joe looked, and his daughter was very scared. She's like, "Daddy, what's going on? What does all this mean?" And he leaned down, gave her a hug, and says, "I don't know. But I'll figure this out, I promise you. Whatever it is I have to make right, I will make right. I promise you, and I'll be safe." And he looked at her in the eye and told her, "Whatever happens, you stay here. Don't go out there. I don't want you getting lost. I don't want to have to worry about you too. Stay here with a nice bunny rabbit and be safe. And whatever happens, remember that I love you." And she gave him a big hug, threw her arms around his neck, and says, "I love you too, Daddy." And she said, "Be careful." He said, "I'll do my best." He gave her a kiss, one last hug, and then he stood, looked at the rabbit, and says, "You take care of her." And the rabbit says, "I will. Go now." Joe reluctantly turned, walked towards the front door, turned and gave one last look to his daughter, who was... she was crying. She was obviously frightened. He blew her a kiss and smiled, waved at her, and then opened the door as best he could and slipped out through the opening that he was able to manage, out into the freezing cold and the snowy night once again. He looked out and he said, "Wow, nighttime." This was obviously a different world, because it was daytime not long ago, and he wasn't in that building that long. Time must move differently here. But as he looked around and tried to figure out a direction to go, it was dark, and the shadows were ominous, and he could hear the howling wolves seem to be calling to him. There was a draw to the darkness that he couldn't understand, but he felt he had to resist. And as he turned his collar up and he was about to descend the stairs, he heard a voice, an icy, crackling voice that says, "Psst, hey." Joe looked around. He didn't see anyone, but the voice called out again, "Psst, hey, buddy, over here." Joe looked in the direction that he thought he heard the voice coming from, and there, coming out of the shadows of this gnarled tree, was a snowman. Not a pleasant-looking snowman either. This one had a look of that of a thug about him. He chomped on a small cigar butt. He looked at him and said, "Hey, get down here. You and I have to have a talk." Joe cautiously walked down the steps and approached the snowman. He says, "Who are you?" The snowman says, "I'm Chip. You're Joe Evans, ain't you?" And Joe says, "What if I am?" He said, "You and I have something to discuss. Come with me. We'll talk on the way." And Joe asked, "On the way to where?" And the snowman kind of grinned a little and says, "On the way to your destiny, of course." As Joe and the snowman walked through the darkened streets, through evil-looking shadows and the sound of rumbling thunder and wolves echoing down the alleyways and byways, the snowman and Joe talked, and the snowman told him that there's something he had to do. This whole talk of darkness and light, yeah, there was something to it, and he had to face his fears. All of this was based on his imagination, taken from his childhood, taken from Lost in broken dreams. Joe had a lot of dreams once upon a time. All of them gone with the wind. But some of the dreams live on, and here they are. He himself, Chip, was part of a nightmare he had when he was 6 years old. It was based on a movie his mom watched one night. But if he wants to make things right, there's something he had to do. And the snowman led him to this other gate. It wasn't as large as the main gates, but according to Chip, it was a back gate. And Chip opened up the gate and said, "You gotta go, Joe. You gotta go out there and you gotta face it." Joe didn't know what was going on, but he knew that opening that gate was a bad thing, and he pushed against the gate to close it, but Chip stopped him. And Joe's asking, "What are you doing? We can't open that. We can't let the darkness in." And the snowman says, "Yes, we can. We have to. You see, that's your problem, Joe. You're too good for your own sake. And this is my way of helping you. Got to embrace your darkness, Joe. You could have been something. Oh, the thoughts you've had in your life. The things you've done. The things you could have been. You don't know your own potential, Joe. This is my way of helping you. Gotta let it in, Joe. Gotta let it in." And Joe found out that this snowman was more powerful than he was. He was stronger, and he kept the gates open. And then Joe saw them, the eyes in the darkness, the howling wolves. And then he saw the shapes getting closer to the gate. The biggest wolves he has ever seen approached the gate. And Joe, out of fear and instinct, backed away. And the wolves, about 3 of them, entered the gate. One wolf went that way, one wolf went that way, and the other one just came towards him, stopped and stared, as though they knew each other, as though the wolf was peering into his soul. And Joe was frightened. He was scared. If he had to stop this, he didn't know how. These wolves would tear him apart. He looked up, and the storm clouds had a renewed energy and vigor, and they crept over the city and blanketed in darkness. It was terrible, and the lightning flashed in evil patterns. And then the lightning began to flash and strike the city, destroying buildings. People were screaming left and right. More wolves coming into that gate, and the wolves decided to attack and maul the poor innocent residents of this city. And he, Joe, somehow felt responsible, but didn't know what to do. And the snowman Chip just sat there chomping on his little cigar and laughed and chuckled. "That's it, Joe. Let it in. Let it all in." Joe didn't know what to do. The howling of wolves hurt his ears. He turned and he ran, blindly, wildly through the streets. The chuckling of that snowman echoed on the wind, mingled with the howling of the wolves and the lightning striking buildings. The city was becoming a war zone. Mangled bodies laying in the streets all about him, and others fleeing in terror as the wolves hunted them down and tore them to pieces. And Joe didn't know what to do. He had to make sure his daughter was safe, so he ran to where he knew the church was, and the lightning sending shards of crystal and glass and debris flying everywhere, narrowly missing him. But he knew he had to keep going. Whatever happened, he had to get to that church. He had to make sure Veronica was safe. After a while of torment and anguish and watching the horrible things that happened around him, Joe finally found the church, and he climbed the steps, slipping a couple of times, nearly breaking an ankle. But he climbed up those steps and limping, and he got into the church, and there was his daughter. But the lightning struck the church and blew him backwards down the steps towards the bottom into the snow. And he looked up, and there was his daughter, rushing towards him at the top of the stairs. But wolves saw her as well, and the wolves, they attacked her. They leapt up to the top of the stairs, grabbed her by the clothing, and dragged her down the stairs into the snow. Joe was terrified. He tried to jump into the fray of wolves that was attacking his daughter. He heard her screaming and calling for him, but he was no match for those wolves. And he felt helpless as more and more wolves poured into the scene to pile onto his daughter, and he could only imagine the terrible things that she was enduring right now. And the darkness, oh, the darkness was creeping through the city like a cancer, like this evil mist that was drowning out the light of everything. And the lightning was destroying every beautiful thing that he saw. And the church was now erupting into flames. And more wolves were coming, and the howling, and the more despair he felt. Then he heard a voice on the wind. He heard D'Angelique's voice saying, "Which side of you is going to win, Joe? Which side of you is going to win?" And that's when Joe suddenly realized, oh my God, he's doing this. All of this is a direct result of him. The more helpless, the more depression, and the more bleak everything seems to him, the more the darkness wins. He was controlling this. He had to believe in himself. He had to believe that he could save his daughter. So for a moment, in that moment of revelation, the wolves stopped attacking the daughter and looked at him. And he just picked up a piece of debris, this jagged piece of debris that was laying next to him, and he went in and he started beating on those wolves. He started beating on them until they yelped, until they bled, until they ran and into the darkness and disappeared. And there was his daughter, bleeding, scratched, her clothes torn. But he threw the debris away, grabbed her and held her close. And she was crying. And she threw her arms around him, and she just couldn't stop crying. And he held her, and as the tears filled his eyes, he told her he was so sorry. He was sorry. And he realized that every bad thing that's ever happened to her, ever, was because of him. They're homeless because of him. He couldn't keep a job, and they had no money because of him. Because of his insecurities that were winning out all the time. They won in the end, every time. But now that he knew this, he had a choice to make. He told her, he said that he's asking for her forgiveness. And he's going to make things right. He doesn't know how, but he's going to make things right. And in that moment of joyous revelation, knowing that his daughter was okay, and as he continued to have these thoughts that filled his mind, things became very clear to him all of a sudden. That the things he had to do to make everything right for himself and his little girl. And there was a voice behind him, a bit of laughter, a joyful laughter. And he and his daughter turn around and look, and there, standing in the snow, is Santa Claus. Larger than life, just standing there in all his splendor and glory. The clouds were parting and the sun was starting to shine through. And there was Santa Claus with a big grin on his face saying, "Congratulations, Joe. You did it. You finally figured it out." And Joe looked at him with a smile and said, "Yes, I finally did." And Santa Claus told him that that coin was there for a reason. It's there to help those who need it most. But the choice is always theirs. The outcome is presented, but will the person take it? And you, Joe, have taken it. You did it, Joe. That coin is there for those who need it most. It always presents all available options, but it's up to the individual which outcome they will choose. That's freedom of choice. Everyone has it. Some people know how to use it, others don't. And you, my boy, your love for your daughter was your only salvation. You love her, in the end, more than you love yourself. And that is a remarkable gift. The problem with the world, Joe, is too many grown-ups don't love their children enough. Some people look at their children as more of a burden than a blessing. You don't feel that way. And because of that, you are given a new lease on life. This Christmas gift to you is your chance at salvation. But you still have a choice to make, Joe. Will you take what you learned here and apply it to your own life in the real world? Or will you go about doing everything as you have before? Choice is yours. We'll be watching. And Joe assured Santa that he will take to heart all the lessons he's learned here. And he gave his daughter a hug and said, "I'm ready to do what's right." Santa chuckled. "It's all right. It's time to take you back to the real world. Are you ready?" And Veronica, still marveling at being able to see Santa Claus, looked at her daddy and smiled and says, "I'm ready, Daddy." He says, "Me too." He gave her a hug and a kiss and says, "Let's go home." With a wave of his hand, Santa sent a whirlwind of snow rising up from the ground to surround and swirl around Joe and Veronica. And they were back under the railway overpass, with the sparkling stars overhead and the 50-gallon drum for warmth. And Joe was standing there. His daughter, Veronica, was laying there asleep. And he wondered, was all of this a dream? He was standing in the same spot he was before the snowman arrived. And he looked around, and all the homeless people were back where they're supposed to be, going about whatever they were doing, with their own drums for warmth, some sleeping. And he had a feeling deep in his soul that it did happen. He couldn't explain it, but he knew what he had to do now. And beginning tomorrow was a whole new fresh start for him and his daughter. Fast forward a year later. A car drives down the street. It's not a fancy car, but it's a car. A little dinged and dented in spots. The upholstery was torn in some areas, but there was a man in there, a man wearing nice clothes. This was Joe Evans. His hair cut, and he had a job now and a place to live. And he was doing some last-minute Christmas shopping. His daughter was home and with the babysitter, and he had to get out and do a little bit of Christmas shopping and buy a few last-minute gifts for her. It's the least she deserved. And as he drove down the streets, he passed Lukemeyer Avenue with all its Christmas decorations, and down this one side street where he knew it led to a different shopping center where there was a certain store he wanted to go to. And off to the side, there was a business all lit up with Christmas decorations. And the sign out front said the Silver Snowflake. Now Joe, he had to stop. Oh boy, did he have to stop there. So he found a parking spot, got out, went to the front door, looked around, and the Christmas decorations filled him with joy. And he opened the door, and the little jingling bell alerted the bartender that he had a customer. And Joe looked around, and sure enough, there were all the same old patrons that were there last year with their somehow foreign attire he couldn't quite put his finger on. And as he walked towards the bar, he saw the same bartender with the bow tie, the black vest, and the white button-up shirt. And the bartender looked at him and smiled and says, "Hey, Joe, Merry Christmas." And Joe sat on the bar stool, and he's like, "Yeah, Merry Christmas to you." And the bartender asked him, "What can we get you?" Joe said, "So, do you have any of that proprietor's private reserve?" The bartender looked at him and put a finger to his nose and pulled out the black bottle, poured a glass. And Joe took some money out, some real money, handed it to the bartender, and says, "Keep the change." And the bartender looked at him and smiled. And then Joe, as he's taken a drink and felt the warmth of that liquid just refresh him to the very depths of his soul, he looked off, and there, off to the side, was the coin, just sitting there, sparkling in the light. And he looked at the bartender, and the bartender looked at him and winked. smiled, and then went about his business, taking the towel and wiping out some glasses. And Joe just looked at the coin, not knowing how it got there, but knowing that it was there for when somebody else needed it. In fact, this whole bar was here for when someone else needed it. He couldn't figure out where this bar came from or what it was doing there or how it came into being. But he sensed it wasn't just the coin that was infused with Christmas magic. As Joe took his glass, he turned to face the patrons. All the patrons in the bar smiled, raised their glasses to him. He raised his glass to them. And they all took a drink. And then Joe, he knew that his life was going to be better from now on. And he was going to make sure of it. Last Christmas would live with him forever. And every Christmas would live on in his heart from now until the day he died. And every day, thanks to this place, was filled with Christmas magic. And every day he went to his job, every day he went to his home, every day he was able to give his daughter a hug. That was a miracle. And that was a miracle he would cherish forever. Hello everyone, thank you for watching. It's been really fun. I really enjoy making these videos. If you like the video, please like it below. And remember to subscribe to my channel because I don't want you to miss any of the exciting stories that will be coming your way. Thank you so much. Merry Christmas to all of you. And have a wonderful and blessed New Year.